this demonstration, I will go over how we can install and configure Windows Deployment Services, also known as WDS. WDS allows network-based installation of Windows operating systems. On our Windows Server 2022, open your Server Manager. Then we need to make sure some pre-installation requirements are met before we deploy WDS. One of the key components that we need for WDS is the DSCP server and the DNS server. Without the DSCP server and the DNS server roles, you won't be able to use your WDS deployment. Another additional component that I recommend installing and configuring is the Active Directory Domain Services, also known as ADDS. And I also recommend that you actually configure the Active Directory users and computers and making sure that it is working and running. But that is an additional component that you can use within the WDS configuration. But the DSCP and DNS servers are actually requirements that you have to have in order for you to run your WDS. So make sure before you go ahead and install your WDS that your DNS and the DSCP are working. So for me, on our DSCP, we see that SS Serve 2022 Manuja local server have the DSCP scope already defined. So if you go to our address pool, we have 192.168.1.100 to 192.168.1.200 as DSCP IP addresses. Once the WDS has been installed, it will use the DSCP server to obtain IP addresses for PXE installation. So that's why we need to make sure the DSCP is running. And on the DNS, we see it is running and we have a forward lookup zones and the reverse lookup zones are set up. If I right click on our server, for example, and go to launch NS lookup, we see that it resolved to our IP address. And if I enter our IP address 192.168.1.3, it will resolve to our server. So that means our DNS manager is also working properly. If you don't know how to install DNS server or the DSCP server, I have already posted tutorials on how to install and configure DSCP and DNS servers on my YouTube channel. So you can go ahead and check that. Same apply to the additional component I mentioned, the Active Directory Domain Services. If you don't know how to install it and configure it, there is already videos posted on my YouTube channel. You can go ahead and check it. Once you have all the required components, you can go ahead and install the WDS. To do that, on your Server Manager, go to the Manage menu, select Add Roles and Features, click Next. We will keep it on the role-based or feature-based installation and then click Next. Make sure your server is here and then click Next. And on the roles list, we will go and select the option called the Windows Deployment Services. Now, when you select this option, it will give you a pop-up to add additional tools. And we will make sure that we add those additional tools and also make sure you check the Include Management Tools if applicable and click Add Features. Then we will click Next, and in here under WDS, we see that they mention some notes that includes the requirement of DSCP and DNS services. So we already have done the DSCP and DNS services. It's up and running and you can see that down here. And I have already shown that these are working by going to those services and testing them. So if you haven't installed DSCP and DNS services, make sure you go back and install them first before installing WDS. That way you can go through this process smoothly. So once you have everything done, we can click Next. And we have two roles associated with Windows Deployment Services. They include the deployment server and the transport server. And we need both of these. The deployment server is a type of service that allow us to push our Windows operating systems across our network. So it allows us to customize Windows images to be deployed within our network. The transport server is a service that allows us to use our network facilities, network infrastructure to transmit that data. So we need to have both deployment server and the transport server. So make sure both of them are checked off and then click next. And I'm going to select restart the destination server automatically if required, but you don't need to do that in this particular installation process. Your server will not restart during the process of installing WDS, but I'm going to select that because this is a lab environment. Make sure if you are doing this in a production environment that you don't select this option if there are users connected to your server. So we're going to say yes and click install. So the installation process has been completed. So we didn't need to restart our server. So we can close this window. Now we will have a new feature added under our tools called the Windows Deployment Services. So under tools, we can see it right down here, Windows Deployment Services. So let's go ahead and open our Windows Deployment Services. So it will open the console for the Windows Deployment Services. And on the right hand side, we have the servers listed and we see ssserv 2022.sanuja.local. That is our server. And currently there is nothing there. So if I click on it, it will say Windows Deployment Services is not configured. To configure this server, we're going to right click on that server. So basically right click, select your server and right click. And we're going to choose the option called Configure Server. And in here, you will get a wizard to go through and we have some information related to the Windows Deployment Services configuration. So it tells you that before you begin, ensure you have certain services installed. As I mentioned, ADDS is a kind of an additional feature that you can use, a DSCP as well as DNS and NTFS file system within your hard drives. So this is a Windows Server 2022. It is already using NTFS file system, so I don't have to worry about that. But I made sure that my Active Directory domain services, DSCP and DNS is installed. Then we're going to click next. We will go with the integrated with Active Directory, but you also have the choice of doing a standalone server. So for this particular tutorial, we will keep it on the default integrated with Active Directory because we already have the ADDS installed on this server. And we're going to click next. And it will ask you, where should the remote installation folder be located? So for this, what I have done, I have created a secondary drive, the E drive, that has some roaming profiles and other examples in here. And I'm going to use that E drive. So I'm going to change this C drive to E drive so that it will be installing on that separate hard drive. In production environment, I recommend either use a separate hard drive or some kind of a separated media to install this particular WDS services, because that is a good practice to do that instead of installing on your C drive. So I switch it to E drive and I'm going to click next, and it will ask you a few information related to proxy DSCP server. In here, make sure that you have do not listen on DSCP and DSCP v6 port and configure DSCP options for proxy DSCP, and this will make sure that your WDS is operating correctly. If you want to know what these options do, you can read over here as well. And we're going to leave it as default with these two checked off and click next. And in here, it'll ask you how the PXE server going to authenticate your users or how to respond to your users. So I want my PXE server to respond to all clients known and unknown. So whether it's in our Active Directory or not, it will respond. And in here, we also have the option called require administrator approval for unknown computers. When you select this option, and you must approve the computer using pending devices node in Snap-in to approve, to approve this. So you can select that option. What that basically going to do is allow unknown clients to still communicate to your PXE, but it will still prevent them from installing anything before we allow it manually from our Windows deployment services. So I don't want that, so I'm not going to select that option. So I'm going to say respond to all client computers known and unknown. Then we will click next. So once it is done, what we're going to do is to click finish. Now you have the Windows deployment services installed. It has some information such as the install images, boot images, pending devices, multicast transmission, and drivers. So it has some stuff already listed here, like some certain specific categories under this particular server. But notice this server is not started yet, because see, there is a stop button right here, the stop icon. So what we need to do, we need to right click, and then we're going to go all tasks, and in here we will select start. What that will do, it will go ahead and start our WDS, and it will give you a confirmation message saying successfully started the WDS, and we're going to click OK. Now that button has changed, that image has changed to a green icon with that arrow. So it's like a play button. So now the server is active and live, but the configuration is still not complete. It is still not able to hand out Windows images to any clients requesting them, because we have not configured the boot images. So the first thing we need to do before we go any further, we need to add an ISO that contains Windows operating system. So I have an ISO that is mounted to C drive, and this is the Windows 11 ISO, Windows 11 Enterprise ISO, and I have mounted it to our CD drive. And if you have an ISO image, you can also find your ISO image and right click and mount it. And in this case, I just simply have entered into our CD drive. So basically, just like installing another software, you basically going to mount your Windows operating system. Then what we will do, we will go to the section called boot images in our Windows deployment services console. Right click, and we're going to select add boot image. On here, we need to locate the .wim file, and because we are in the boot images section, what we are looking for is boot.wim file, not the other one. So we're going to click browse in here, and then we need to navigate to our drive where we have the Windows ISO file. So it's in here, and we will go into the sources folder. And under the sources folder, what we are looking for is boot.wim. So that will be this file. So make sure you don't select the install.wim, but rather boot.wim file, and click open. And we're going to click next. And it will ask you to name your boot image. So I'm just going to leave it as it is, the default one, but you can name it whatever you like. For example, you can say Windows 10, Windows 11, etc., etc., to make it easier for you to identify. And I'm going to click next, and in here it will tell you that it found this location because we gave that path, and it will give you the name that it will be added to this boot images section. So we're going to click next, and that what we'll do is it will add that boot image information to this console. So once you get the successful message, click finish. Now you have the Microsoft Windows setup right here because that's what we name, and we have the OS version and information in here. Next, what we will do, we will go to the Install Images section, right click and select Add Install Image. So if you have not created any install image group, the PXE installation process will ask you to create a image group. So you have the option either to create a group by I will show you by right clicking here on the install images and click add image group, or just use the option called add install image, and if you don't have any groups you can create that during that process. So we're just going to go add image, and we're going to keep the default group name as it is, but you can change it whatever you like. Click next, and this time because we are in the install images folder, we need to make sure that we pick the install.wim file. So we're going to click browse again here, again on that C drive under the sources, in my case is the D drive, and we're going to pick the install.wim because that's the file that we want for the install images option. So we're going to click OK. We're going to click next, and in here we have the options available on that image. So it looks like we only have Windows 10 options in here, no Windows 11 options. And I'm going to select the one that will give us the best option for my installation process. So you can pick whatever the option you like that is available on these images. So I don't want the home end, so I'm going to remove those. We have the education options as well, so I'm going to remove those as well. I'm just going to simply install the Windows 10 Pro, but you can actually have all these options available to you enabled, or you can pick just one of them. So just for fun, just I'm gonna allow the Windows 10 Education and Windows 10 Pro, so both of them. And then what we're gonna do, let's pick the Windows 10 Pro Education, that option. So Windows 10 Pro and Windows 10 Pro Education, and I'm gonna click the option called use the default name and description for each of the selected images, so it is easy for me to find. I'm gonna click next. So I have two options, one called Windows 10 Pro and Windows 10 Pro Education, and it is attached to the image group 1, and we're gonna click next, and that will add those images to our WDS. Once those images has been added and you get the successful message, we can click finish, and it will populate those two images that we have added from that ISO to your WDS. So now your WDS is running, and we know our DSCP and DNS servers are running, and you can also see the WDS is running. Now what you can do is to see if this process actually worked. I'm using VMware Workstation Pro, so I will go into my next virtual machine, the one we have set up here. And I have set it up in a way so that it will have network boot enabled. And I'm going to click the power on this machine, and what that's going to do is that will go and try to find an operating system. Because it doesn't have it, it will be booting from the network, also known as PXE. It found our WDS boot manager, and it gives us the information that it receives, such as the IP address. So I'm going to go back here. I will show you again, because I didn't press enter in time. It just boot back onto the settings of firmware or BIOS. So again, so it gives us the client IP address, that is the DHCP IP address. It gives us our server IP address, which is 192.168.1.3. If we go back onto our Windows server, and if you go to local server, we see, hey, our IP address for this server is 192.168.1.3, and it has the DHCP IP address as well, which is 192.168.1.102. And I'm going to press enter here before this disappear again, and that will boot into our boot image that we have, boot.wim, which is located on our Windows Server, Windows Deployment Services under boot images, and this one. So this is the one now being loaded. Please note, WDS is used for deploying images over PXE, and I will cover Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, also known as MDT, which extends the capability of OS image deployments on my future videos. Please make sure to thumbs up this video and subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions about WDS or deployment of Windows OS images across networks, feel free to reach out to me. Until next time, have a nice day.